We are living through a difficult and dangerous time right now, the likes of which we have never experienced before. Today, I'm going to talk about the present crisis and not about the past. And if Jewish tradition has any insights to offer us about this pandemic, we surely want to know what they are. I feel that there are burning questions that are on the minds and hearts of every one of us, whether we are worshiping at home or here in the sanctuary or wherever we may be. How can we stay optimistic? How can we keep our spirits up in the midst of this terrifying pandemic? And the final question, the one that consumes us all consciously or unconsciously: can one find peace or even happiness in the midst of this pandemic? Every morning we begin the day by reading the newspaper or by listening to newscasters on television, and they tell us how many people have tested positive for COVID-19, how many people have been hospitalized, and how many people have died. And these figures are in the hundreds of thousands. It's impossible to wrap your mind around such staggering numbers. And so the question that is on our minds is, how is it possible to be at peace while seeing these numbers every day? Statistics convey one kind of truth. Individual stories convey a deeper and more powerful truth. I know at least two people who lost their lives in these last months. And if these people were people whom you cared about, they are not just statistics. They may be friends, and their passing has left a huge chasm within you. If you have a friend who died alone in the hospital with no family member allowed to enter the room and to hold his hand as he left this world, or if you have a friend who died alone in a house with no one even aware of his death, you cannot think about these people and not feel the pain of their loneliness and sadness in the way they died. And so the central question that I want to talk about with you today is, can we find peace, a centering moment in the midst of this pandemic? The short answer is that we can, but it's not easy to do. Peace during a pandemic is not easy to achieve, but it is possible. My colleague, Rabbi Wesley Gardenswartz of Boston, says there is no mitzvah in the Torah that says we are supposed to be depressed. Being depressed will not help you, and it will not help anyone else. And so we should strive to be strong and at peace. But how do we get there? We did not choose this pandemic. It chose us. But now that it has chosen us, we do have a choice in how we respond to it. And so I want to offer you 3 suggestions of what we can do to keep our spirits up and avoid the sense of depression that can bring us down low as the virus itself can. The first comes from a prayer that we say every day in the morning service. It is the prayer that thanks God for creating both light and darkness. I think that prayer is meant to be a reminder to us that God has created this world in such a way that every single person, with no exceptions, has some light and some darkness in his or her life. There have been some days in my life when the sun was shining and the breeze was wonderful, and I felt like dancing with joy. Some of us have had a day when the girl with whom we were in love with said yes to go on a date. And there was the day when we got a first job. And there was the day when perhaps we saw our child for the very first time. On those days, we perhaps felt that the sunshine would never end and that we would have youth and energy and happiness forever. But it did end. And therefore, the prayer book reminds us every morning of the truth that whoever thinks that the sunshine will last forever is not a realist, and whoever thinks that the sun will never rise again is also not a realist. I know people who felt they were living in total darkness, whether it was because of an illness that racked their body with excruciating pain, or the time when there was a loss of a first job, or a second, or a third, or the time when a best friend moved away to another city and we knew that we would never see him again. We have lived through some dark times in our lives. And each person in the midst of such a time thought that this darkness would never end. But eventually it did. Sometimes it took a very long time. But eventually the darkness went away and the first rays of dawn emerged again. And so I believe that the first lesson that we need to learn if we are to keep our spirits up during this frightening period is that someday it will end, and we must remember this every day. We don't know when, we don't know how. We don't know if it will end by the discovery of a vaccine or whether it will end when we build up resistance to this virus. I am sure that someday this darkness will lift. The Black Plague was much, much worse than the coronavirus was by far, and it eventually ended. And the influenza epidemic of 1918 was much worse than the coronavirus, but eventually it ended. And therefore, I believe that this epidemic will end someday. And the light is coming. The words of the psalmist remind us of this, affirming, "LeDavid Adonai ori v'ishi mimei ra." The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? God is an expression of the spiritual and physical light that exists within this world. And that is the first truth we must hold on to stay hopeful in this dark time. That is why we say every morning, Yotzer Or Uvore Choshech. God created light and God created darkness, and he made them in such a way that neither one lasts forever. We affirm this truth each morning and evening in our liturgy. The second truth that we must hold on to, if we are to stay optimistic, is that we are God's partners, and that it is our task to increase the amount of light in the world and fight against the darkness. It is our task to make peace in this world. Prayer, as we Jews understand it, is not a time when we tell God what we need or want and then sit back and watch while God does what we say. As Rabbi Jack Reamer writes, prayer is a time when we pour out our hearts to God and to ask him to help us to do what needs doing. Prayer, as we Jews understand it, is a time when we make a promise to do the work of God in this world with confidence that he will help us, and with the knowledge that if we do this, we will be doing the work of God in this world. I know some people, as you do, who have done God's work during these last few months, and they have done it faithfully and courageously. There are the volunteers from our community who every week make sure the hungry downtown are fed and clothed. There are many such people, and every one of them deserves our respect, for they fulfill the words we say in the morning service, in which we promise that we will be partners with God in bringing light into the world. And there is one more lesson that we should learn in this time of COVID-19 that we are going through. It's a simple lesson, and it is a lesson that all of us, myself included, did not think much about until the virus came. And that lesson is that our lives are frail and fragile. We have no control over the future, and therefore, if there is someone we love, whom we are on the outs with, now is the time to bless them or make up with them. Now and not tomorrow. For if this virus has taught us anything, it is that nobody owns tomorrow. There is a chapter at the end of the book of Breshit in which Father Jacob gathers his children around his bedside and bids farewell to them. He blesses them one by one, and he tries to teach them how to live after he is gone. I've read this chapter at least once a year for many years, but this year a commentary by Rabbi Reamer raised two questions in my mind that I'd never thought about before. One about Abraham, and one about Isaac. And these are the questions. Abraham was surely a loving father. So why did he not do what Jacob did? He was on the outs with his son Ishmael, whom he pushed out of the house at the insistence of Sarah, and they had not spoken to each other in many years. Why did he not make up with Ishmael at the end? And Abraham surely loved Isaac. Isaac was the son who was destined to carry on the covenant. So why did he not bless Isaac and wish him well when he was on his deathbed? Why did Abraham not do what Jacob did? And the mystery deepens when we think about Isaac. Isaac, like his father Abraham, had two sons, and these sons, like the children of some of us, did not get along with each other. They fought over a number of things. They fought to the point where one of them, Jacob, had to leave the house to escape his brother's anger. And then Esau left the house as well and moved to the land of Edom. My question is, why did Isaac not do what Jacob did? Why did he not call his kids together when he was on his deathbed and persuade them to make up with each other? If you think about it, the answer is obvious. Ishmael was not around when his father died. He had gone back to Egypt. He came back for his father's funeral, and he made up with his brother there. But when his father died, Ishmael was many miles away. And the same thing is true of Isaac. I am sure that he would have liked to say goodbye to his children before he died. And I'm sure that he would have wanted to bless them, and he would have wanted to persuade his two children to embrace each other and make up before he died. Because when Isaac died, he was living in Beersheba, Esau was living in Edom, and Jacob was living in Hebron. And so Isaac was unable to bless them and to persuade them to make up the way Jacob did before he died. Abraham and Isaac had no control over the situation. Only Jacob was lucky enough to be able to gather his children around his bedside and bless them before he died. Only Jacob was able to determine the circumstances under which he died. He was given that blessing. I realize that most of us will probably end our lives more like Father Abraham and like Father Isaac did than like Jacob. Many of us will die in a hospital or a nursing home. Most of us live in one place, and most of our children live in other places. And even if we are lucky enough to have children who live nearby, most of us will have no control over the end of our lives. And therefore, the time to connect or reconcile with the people that you love is now. You cannot wait until the end, because none of us knows when our end will be. And none of us knows where our children will be at that time. And none of us knows whether we will be as fortunate as Jacob was, or whether we will be alone at the end, as Abraham and Isaac were. And therefore, I ask you in the name of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to say what you need now, to bless whomever you need to bless, and thank whomever you need to thank. And if there is anyone whom you are on the outs with, whether it is your spouse or your sibling or one of your parents or one of your children, I ask you to make up with them now while you still can. Because if you do, you will add to the light in the world before the great darkness sets in, and it is too late to do so. Darkness comes to everyone. Darkness is a given. So light comes when we bring it in. And if we do, we can feel peace even in this pandemic. May these be the three lessons we learn from this plague. First, that every person's life contains light and darkness. Second, that it is our task to be partners with God in increasing the amount of light in this world. And third, that if we have someone to love or someone to bless or someone to thank, do it now. For if we do, then we can have peace and even some happiness in this time of the pandemic. I pray that you may be safe in this perilous time, and I hope that you may be wise. And to this let us say, Amen.